A blessing to be with you this evening, and as we start looking a little more at Samuel, and some of this we're not going to go verse by verse as we kind of get into this part of 1 Samuel, but we're going to try to take some things out of it that I think are important, that we begin to see a little bit darker side of Saul tonight. We begin to see David fleeing for his life. We talked about the covenant that was made between David and Jonathan. And in that covenant, which would be a lifetime covenant and made David a very covenant-keeping person, then we get into this place where he begins now to know that Saul is definitely after him. Saul wants to kill him. It's not a hidden thing anymore. It's very open. It's very much something that he knows. He knows he needs to flee. He knows that he needs to get away from Saul. But you know, I think something maybe you don't see here that I think is important is, and you'll kind of start to see it, is that David didn't go alone. You know, this isn't just David running from Saul. David has men around him, people around him, that are also fleeing with him. You know, David was popular, wasn't he? He was successful. He was successful in his victory. He was successful in his battles. The Lord was with him in everything that he put his hand to do. And it's no different in any time in history. People that are successful tend to have people that attach themselves to them because they want to be part of that success, right? And it was no different with David. You know, even Jesus, especially in the middle of his ministry, you know, Jesus became very popular, didn't he? People attached themselves to him. People followed him. Crowds followed him so much that you couldn't even get next to him. People wanted to be a part of what he was. Even though they really might not have understood what he was, they wanted to be part of it because it was big, it was exciting, it was the thing, right? And everybody wants to be part of the thing. But you all know, if you've lived long enough, that most of the time the things don't last that long. Y'all remember the pet rock? Yeah, that never lasts that long. So most of the time the things don't last that long, right? But you know, they wanted that. But David had the success and had already had this success. We saw this in the story. And because of this, there was men who were going to stay with David and bind themselves to David. And some of these men were going to bind themselves to him for a lifetime. So there's a lot of relationships here that's going on besides just Jonathan and David. But this covenant at the end of 20, of course, is very important. And we're going to get back into that. But I think 21 is a chapter we need to spend a little time with before David starts fleeing all the time. Because it's a time when David has decided that he needs to get away. He needs to get away from Saul. He needs to get away from this threat. And it gives you an idea at the beginning of this how hurriedly he did that. He didn't have provisions. He didn't have, and you know, like I said, you think, well, it's just David. Well, it's not just David. David's got people with him. And these people have got to eat. And so David comes to the priests, right? And he at Nob, and he asks them if there's something to eat. And this is kind of an interesting chapter, interesting thought, because Jesus brings this up about David eating the consecrated bread. So Jesus kind of refers to this same thing. When Jesus is criticized, right? Criticized for eating on the Sabbath, and he brings this up. Didn't even David eat the consecrated bread? So, you know, what does that mean when he does this? You know, Amalek, one thing you get at the beginning of this, he's oblivious to this turmoil between Saul and David. He doesn't know anything about it. As far as he knows, David's still, well, he's the king's son-in-law, which is still true, right? Because he's married to, and so he's still the king's son-in-law, married to Michelle. Some might think that ought to be Michelle or something. But anyway, he's married to the king's daughter. He's the king's son-in-law. and he was highly favored, right? He was going out to fight these battles for Saul. As far as Amalek is concerned, David is still in good graces with this idea. David said to Amalek the priest, the king has commissioned me with the matter and has said to me, let no one know anything about it. So David's a little deceitful here. I'm sending you, and I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. And the priest answered, there's no ordinary bread on hand, but there's consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women. What does it mean to have consecrated bread? Why is that important? What does that have to do with anything? Yeah, it's set aside, right? This bread's set aside for a special purpose, these guys that have to stay away from women. This bread's been consecrated. And so David answered and he said, surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more then today will their vessels be holy? So it's this idea of sanctification, right? So what were they, when you think about this whole idea, this seems a little odd maybe to me and you, a little bit different to us maybe. Because, well, different time for one thing, different place, right? So he says they had to be kept apart from women, right? They had to have a holy vessel, talking about their own body. Their vessel had to be holy. So, who are these women? I mean, why are we having this discussion? I mean, I thought, what's going on here a little bit? Kind of makes you kind of go back a little bit. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about prostitutes? Are we talking about temple prostitutes, pagan prostitutes? Are we talking about, what are we talking about here, right? These women that they're supposed to stay holy from. David's argument is, and David once again misleading here, when David says it's an ordinary journey, because it's not an ordinary journey. He's fleeing from Saul. This is not an ordinary journey. David is once again misleading this priest by thinking, everything's good, I'm good with Saul, we're just on this special mission that Saul sent us on, and we need to eat. David's pretty deceitful right here. Would you agree with that? This is pretty deceitful, right? Because if David had been honest here and said, Saul's after me, we're fleeing from Saul, and Saul wants to kill me, the priest might have thought about this quite a bit differently than the way that he did, right? Because there's some deceit here, isn't there? We don't think much about that, do we? We think about David. We think about David, a man's after God's own heart. We've talked about some of these things with David, and once again here you get a little picture here. David's hungry. These guys with him are hungry. He's bending the rules, right? Isn't he? He's bending the rules here. No, Saul's still king. Saul's still in charge. Saul's still large and in charge. But, and this is interesting too, because if you look at here, Dog the Edomite, listen to who he is. One of the servants of Saul. He's an Edomite. Who are the Edomites? Descendants of, descendants of Lot, right? The Edomites. They're enemies of Israel most of the time. Why is this Edomite? Because this is really going to play into the story, Why is this Edomite Saul's servant? Why does Saul have an Edomite as one of his servants? And that's kind of a hard idea. It says he's the chief of Saul's shepherds. And David said to Amalek, now is there a spear or sword? For I didn't bring anything. You think the priest might have caught on about right here that David left in a hurry, right? Because I think as hurried as David might leave, I think the one thing he would grab would be his sword, right? But he doesn't have anything. And he says, oh yeah, Goliath's sword's here. So Goliath's sword's been hiding out here. And we all know how big Goliath was and how big Goliath's sword was. And I'd say Goliath's sword wasn't a sword you probably really wanted to use most of the time, because it was probably heavy and it was probably hard to wield, I would think, because we know how big Goliath was, right? But this tells you there's nothing else. This is it. So there's some desperation here. I'm hungry. I have no weapons. I'm going to mislead you a little bit here because I want to get this done. And if I'm truthful with you, it might not play out so good for me. And once again, we kind of see a little chink in the armor, don't we? A little chink in David's armor. Because it's really, I think, you and I, and like I said before, our view sometimes of David, our view of a lot of Old Testament characters is VBS views. That's what we know. That's the view we know. We know from VBS, and and it's in our mind. It's in my mind too. That's how we were raised. It's what we were brought up with. We were brought up with these VBS views of the Old Testament, because we really don't study the Old Testament a lot. But the one time we get the Old Testament is Vacation Bible School, right? Because we love those stories, don't we? We love David killing Goliath. We love Moses and in the Hebrews going across the Red Sea. We love the burning bush. We love the Moses in the basket. We love all these Old Testament stories, right? We love Naaman going down and being cleansed in the Jordan River. We love those stories because those stories are part of us. They're part of our childhood. We were raised up with that. But it's really funny sometimes as adults, and I think that's where we really mess up. Because as adults, when we go back and look at these stories, we have such a jaded view of it that sometimes we really don't look at a lot of the underlying things that's going on here, because we have that VBS view of these characters. And we know David's a man after God's own heart, and the Bible says David's a man after God's own heart. And we really hang our hat on that, and we should, because David's a covenant-keeping guy, right? David's going to keep this covenant with Jonathan throughout his life. David's a covenant keeper. God's a covenant keeper, right? But the truth is that David was flawed, as most humans are, and sometimes we miss those flaws, but yet this person who wrote Samuel wanted us to know that David had flaws. Otherwise, he wouldn't have put it in here. He didn't have to write this down. He could have wrote down the peachy story. He could have wrote down all the good. He didn't have to write this stuff down. There's a reason it's here. And that's the reason, and when we look at Scripture, that's something you have to think about. There's a reason it's here, There's a reason it's written down. There's a reason we have it. And I think when you start to look at this story, and you see this deceit of David here, it reminds you of deceit of another Old Testament character that we really, really like a lot, and that's Abraham, right? Abraham, right? Wasn't he deceitful with Sarah, saying she's my sister, right? Which she was technically, but not saying she's my wife. He did that a couple of times, right? So this happens here. And so when we kind of start to look at that a little bit, the servants said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Which is that shows you the position that in people's minds David had ascended to, and that also helps to show you the schizophrenia of Paul, right? Because these people had come to the idea that they were starting to recognize David. Isn't this him? Didn't they sing about him, right? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and graciously feared the king of Gath, right? So he decides his sanity. He acted insanely in their hands, scribbled on the doors of the gate, and his saliva ran down his beard. David was God's guy, right? David was God's man. He could have easily fought. He could have easily won. And yet here he feels like he's outnumbered, outgunned at the end of this. The problem with this thing is that his deceit is going to cost the lives of all these priests. David it seems, I've often said, there's no better example of the cost of sin than David in the Bible. I mean, if you really want to know what sin costs, David's the man. I mean, God forgave David. God loved David. God did all these things for David. And yet every time David, seems like David got into these things, people die. And this is what's going to happen here. The idea here is that Saul's going to show up. Amalek's oblivious. He thinks he did the right thing. He thinks David's on a mission. David's on a mission from Saul. He's helping the king. He's helping David. He's doing the right thing. Yeah. Yeah, there was bread to go in, hot bread to go in to replace it, that technically wouldn't have been consecrated yet, but it was still hot bread, basically, still cooking. So that would have replaced the consecrated bread when they ate the consecrated bread. And basically the idea there is that David was he was basically wanting to take all of that. You know, there's still hot bread coming, there's still more bread coming. It's not consecrated, but you can't take it, it's not ready yet. So I'm going to take the consecrated bread, you know. So he took what was ready. He took the consecrated bread. He didn't wait on the other that was going to replace it because he was in a hurry. He needed to get out of there. He knew Saul was on his heels. So it's one of those things where, you know, David, he tried to make that right. My men haven't been with women because we've been, and then he said, an ordinary journey, which of course they hadn't been, and possibly they hadn't been with women. We don't know how long a time frame that those men would not be with women to eat that consecrated bread. But I think the thing you need to see here is, you know, is kind of that deceit that was going on here. And the idea David was in a rush, and David wasn't going to wait for the other bread. So the priest gives him the consecrated bread. The reason they bring up the consecrated bread so much, I don't think, is because of the consecrated bread. It's because of what you said. There's bread coming. I can't wait. I got to go. I got to run. I'm fleeing from Saul. Give me what you got. Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea. It kind of gives you the idea of the urgency, the hurry. I got to go. Yeah. Why do they criticize Jesus for eating the corn on the Sabbath? Yeah, but by whose law? Yeah, you know. I mean, the Sabbath says you can't work, right? But it doesn't say you can't eat, it says you can't cook. But once again, you get into that argument, what's work, right? And then they also criticize them for not washing their hands, right? They're just eating this corn as they walk, as they go. But I think the reason that's always a confusing passage. You know, why does Christ bring this up in that context? But, you know, I think what Jesus was kind of telling them was that, you know, oral law doesn't really count. You know, what David did, even though you could look at this and said David did the wrong thing because David ate the consecrated bread. The bread was consecrated because it's supposed to be for men who kept themselves from women. David basically said they met that qualification, that it was okay, but from a strict law standpoint, it wasn't okay. From a strict Pharisaical, which there wasn't Pharisees at the time of David, but from a strict Jewish traditional standpoint, they would have said, no, you can't do that. Even though, really, I kind of made it. We kind of meet the qualification, and I think Jesus, you know, when they ate the corn walking through the cornfield, you know, that was an oral law. That was their law. That wasn't God's law. Jesus wasn't breaking God's law doing that. He was breaking their law doing that. They thought it was wrong. But Jesus, of course, said, no, it's not wrong. And this technically probably wasn't wrong either, but from the outside looking in, you're like, oh, yeah, you can't do that. So I think maybe that was the reference. But it's always been a difficult passage why Jesus references this, in the middle of this, I think. So, David's in caves now. And he took these people in, distressed people, indebted people, people that were indebted, people that were discontent. They gathered to him. He became a captain, and there was about 400 men with him. So David's fame, David's band is growing, and a lot of these people are people that are discontent with Saul, discontent with whatever. They're people who are in debt. They're people who, for some reason, want to follow David. They want to get out of the society that they're in. And of course, David, they began to look up to him because David's somebody to look up to. David's a leader. David's successful. David's going to have success whatever David does. God's with him. So they're staying with him. They're traveling with him. But in the middle of all this, a prophet of Gad said to David, "Don't stay in the stronghold, depart, go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Arah. And Saul heard that David, the men who were with him, had been discovered. Saul was setting a Gilboa So Saul's going to follow him now. And Saul's going to come up to try to kill him. And he's going to take a lot of people with him. Saul is to this point now that he wants to kill David. There's no secret about this. He wants to kill David. He's going to kill David. He's going to take every resource he has to try to make that happen. He sees David as a threat to the throne. He sees David in league with his son. His son doesn't really want the throne. Saul's in a hard place. Saul wants to put an end to this. He's the king. And so he goes up to this. And then the Edomite, he said, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, and Amalek, the son of Abiah, and he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And the king sent someone to summon Amalek the priest, the son of Abiah, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king." And then Saul decides to kill the priests. When you think about this, like I said, this is a story, right? And we're supposed to get something out of it. But this is kind of the point where Saul turns against God. Saul's all these things, but now Saul is actually going to kill the priests of God. It doesn't get much worse than this. This is as bad. And the people who are with him, they refuse to do this, right? In Amalek, he says, listen, he says, "Who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house?" Amalek says, this is a good guy. This is a guy that you trust. This is a guy that's your son-in-law. This is a guy that I should help. And I just did what I thought you would want me to do. Amalek's oblivious to anything that he's done wrong, and yet he's going to pay this terrible price. He says, "Inquire the God from today, far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servants as to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair." Right? And the king said, "You shall die, you and all your father's house." At what point, at what mental point is Saul here? Right? What is the purpose? What is the point of what he's doing? He has turned against God. He has turned against him now. Not just that he's not inquiring him, not just that he's not wanting to seek his guidance, he's physically turned against him. And so he tells these servants, he said, "Kill him," right? But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. And look at the terminology here. And look at what it says. Priests of the Lord, that's a tetragrammaton right there. That is the name of God. I mean, it's not just saying the priests of a God or the priests of the Lord. It's the priests of God, the name of God. We're not going to kill them. How could we kill the priests of God? I mean, these are Israelites. How could they do that? I couldn't do that. They can't do that. But this Edomite who Saul had brought into his house as a servant, who was the chief of his shepherds, this Edomite who wasn't a Hebrew, this Edomite killed 85 priests who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants. You know, we talk about the Israelites attacking other nations in the Old Testament, and we struggle with that. They kill the women, they kill the children, they kill everything, and we struggle. But this is a case where Saul is killing his own people, his own infants, his own children, the people that he's supposed to be king over. Saul is killing them for something that they didn't even know they did wrong, and he's killing everybody in this town that didn't even know they'd done anything wrong, because he's determined he's going to wipe out the lineage of Amalek. You see how deep, how dark this is. This is dark, isn't it? This is a really dark chapter of the Bible. It's one of those chapters that you should just hide away, and maybe should have never been written. But it was written there so that we could see the point to which Saul had sunk, the point to which he had got in the price of sin. Who's responsible for the death of these priests, ultimately? Who caused the death of these priests? Was it Saul? Was it David? You know, Saul gave the order, but David set it up, didn't he? With his deceit. David set it up, and David will admit it. And Abiathar, the only one who escapes is Abiathar, the only person in that house. So he goes to David. He says, they've killed the priests. And listen to what David says. David says, I knew on that day when Dog the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. David takes the responsibility. David says, I have done this. I have brought about the death of your entire household. This isn't a David story we teach in VBS, is it? I mean, this isn't the David that we think about when we think about David. This isn't the picture we have in our mind, is it? The picture we have. But people will always disappoint us, won't they? It seems. And then he says, stay with me, do not be afraid. He who seeks your life seeks my life. Stay with me, I will protect you. You can stay with me. You know, it's one of those places in the Bible where you see the consequences of actions. And when I read this, I often think of things I've done in my life, thinking back as an older guy now. I think Harold said I could say I was old now. Now that I'm an older guy. You know, and I've done some things in my life, said some things, done some things that really cause problems down the road, you know. Things that, it's one of those things, if you could go back and change it, you probably would, because you probably didn't know what all it was going to cause when you did it. But, you know, there's no take-backs, is there? There's no do-overs. We just have to learn from mistakes, don't we? And learn to be better than what we were before. Maybe this is a lesson for David. Maybe. But it really kind of tells you the consequences sometimes of actions. The Edomite? Well, it says he was a chief over his shepherds, so, I mean, I guess he could have been a slave, but... Right. Yeah, well, the Edomites and the Hebrews were always fighting. No, he didn't care about the priests. No, the Edomites weren't. Yeah, they didn't care anything about that. That wouldn't, yeah. That's why he killed the priests, but the Israelites wouldn't kill him. But the Edomite would, because he wasn't Hebrew. I mean, he didn't care. But the problem was Saul, who is Hebrew, Saul, who was the king of the people, is the one who gave the order to kill the priests of God. You know, when they say in the Bible, the New Testament, Jesus says they killed the prophets, you know, they killed their own people. You know, don't ever forget that. You know, when prophets came and told the Israelites what the Israelites didn't want to hear, they killed them. They did terrible things to them. They put Jeremiah in caves underneath Jerusalem and tore up the stuff he had written because they didn't want to hear what Jeremiah had to say. People don't want to hear what people don't want to hear sometimes, even if it's true. And you know, we see that in the Bible. And that's how come Jesus said in Matthew 23, when you see the lament of Christ, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I like to put you under my wings," right? "And yet you were unwilling. And behold," he said, "your house is left to you desolate." You know, you understand the lament of Christ, right? You understand why he says, we've warned you, we've told you, we've sent people. God has sent prophets to you. He sent people to tell you what to do. He sent people to tell you how to live. He sent people to tell you to straighten up over and over and over. And what have you done with them? "How long I've longed to put you under my wings," as a chick gathered you. You were unwilling, Jesus says. "Behold, your house is left to you desolate." You know, you understand. You can begin to understand what God's saying here, what's going on here with this. You know, and I think it's a bigger, you start to get a bigger picture maybe, and maybe a little different picture of David as you go through this. I know the first time I really studied Samuel for myself, I really came away with a lot different view of David than what I'd previously had. Not that I think David's a bad guy. I mean, David was a great king. David did great things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a David basher. I'm not sitting here to bash David. I'm just sitting here to say there's lessons in this text that we can learn from if we look at the whole text, instead of just putting David on this pedestal and saying, "Oh, David's a great king, David's a guy after God's own heart, all this is good." If we really kind of look at it, then we come away with these lessons that were put here for our benefit. There's a lot of fleeing, running, and fighting through this part of 1 Samuel. We're not going to go verse by verse through all this, so you're welcome to read it. And there's stuff in it. There really is. But one thing I think you begin to see, especially in 23, because you get this shift. So we go through 21, go through 22. The priests get killed. David kind of realizes his mistake. Saul turned away from God. Saul's killing God's prophets now, killing God's priests. But then I think it's really interesting, the shift in 23, when all of a sudden, right off the bat in 23, we're getting David inquiring of the Lord. You see it? You see it in 2. You see it in 4. You see David turning towards God. As Saul turned away from God, David turns towards God. And I think that's what they want you to see here. You know, David is gaining God's favor. David is leaning upon the Lord to make decisions. He's leaning upon the Lord to give him answers. He's leaning upon the Lord to guide him in the right way. And Saul is leaning upon Saul. Saul's leaning upon his might, upon his kingship, upon what he thinks is right, upon his lineage. Saul more and more is drawing back and leaning upon himself, where David more and more is leaning towards God and inquiring of God about what you want me to do. Will I win? Will I be successful? What should I do? Inquiring of the Lord as to the path that he should take. So when we get to this really dark part in 21 and 22, and then immediately in 23, we begin to see David shine. Right? Because Saul is continually on the decrease here. David is coming up. David is becoming the star of the story now. As he goes through these battles, he begins to get more and more fame. He begins to get more and more people. He's got a priest with him now, right? Because he saved him. And you'll see that here. It came about when Abiathar, the son of Amalek, fled to David, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. What's the significance of that? What's an ephod? Priestly clothes. That linen hangs down, right? And the high priest, behind his ephod, the high priest had the Urim and the Thummim. two stones to divine God's will were behind the ephod of the high priest. So he had the ability, by the Urim and the Thummim, he had the ability to cast a lot, as we would say, and determine the will of God. So the ephod is what's the priestly garb. It's what set the priests apart. The high priest ephod had 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. It had the Urim and the Thummim behind it. So it was a very special garment. We know about that. Aaron wore that. But that's what gave him that priestly attire and set him as priest. And so David here, as Saul didn't turn towards Samuel, didn't turn towards the priesthood, here David seeks the priest, seeks to turn towards God, seeks to know God's will. And it's really a big thing, and it should set the tone for what's coming. Why was David so reliant upon God here, though? You know, what's turning David towards God? What turns us towards God most of the time in our life? Distress, right? We get distressed. We look to God because there's problems, because we need God. We need help. We're sick, or somebody's sick, or we're looking for guidance, or we're looking for meaning in our life, or we find God because we're looking. I mean, plain and simple. God doesn't just drop on our face. It's not like the little golden corral guy that dings you on the head with a skillet. God doesn't just appear. We find God because we look for God, and that's exactly what Jesus said. He says, ask and you shall, right? Seek, knock. Jesus says it. He says, if you look for me, you'll find me. Isn't that what the New Testament says? James says, draw near to God, and he will what? Draw near to you, right? We find God and we seek him. David's seeking God here, seeking his will, seeking to know, because David is distressed. David's running for his life. David's fleeing Saul. David had all these people to take care of now that he didn't have to worry about before. And all of a sudden, David's a captain of all these people, and they're looking for him to eat, and they're looking for him to take care of them, and they're looking for him to find some place to sleep and some place to stay, and they're looking for him to protect them from everybody. And David's running, and David's scared from Saul, and David's staying in the lands of people who are enemies of the Hebrews, and David is looking towards God because David is distressed. When David sins with Bathsheba, how's David doing? How's it going for David? But his life is, he's on top of the world, right? Read the text. God's gave him rest from all his enemies. His army's out fighting, and he's staying back in Jerusalem in the palace, letting them go fight his battles for him. You see, why did David quit seeking the Lord? I think Saul killed the priest because he was setting an example that nobody helps David. Doesn't matter who you are. You help David, you're going to die. I think the point of killing the priest was just that. He's saying, you're not safe. You help David, you're going to die. You know, it was a message. He was sending a really strong message that said, David ain't welcome, and I'm after David, and you can't help him. If you do, it's going to get bad. Yeah. And maybe the Lord wouldn't have angered against him because he had been told he was king. Right? Yeah, but when David sheltered there, when David took that food and took that shelter, I think, like David said, he knew when he saw him that it wasn't going to go good, you know. He knew that. But I think David was desperate. You know, we do things when we're desperate that we might not do when we're not desperate. You know, and David was desperate. I've never been that hungry, but thankfully. I've been pretty hungry a few times. But I've never been that hungry, you know. But if he was hungry enough, you'd probably do what you needed to do to eat. I just think you would. I think you would. Yeah. So, it's easy to sit back and look at it, but I don't think we knew how hungry they were either. and how quick they left and the position they were in, and no weapons, and it was bleak. And David saw a way out, an escape, and David took it. Yeah. But when David was well, when things were good, that's when he had a sin with Bathsheba, right? Now, he's distressed, he's fleeing, he's scared. And you know, the other thing I see here with David, just from my perspective, is something I kind of talked about a second ago, but that now he has a lot of responsibility. You know, before, he really didn't have that. It was just him, it was Saul. But now, all these people are dependent on him. He's got all these people following him. Things have changed. This has become a logistical nightmare. 400 men, a lot more than that by now. You know how hard it is to feed that many people, take care of that many people? It's pretty easy to hide in a cave when there's 10 or 15 of you. It's pretty hard when there's 1,000 of you, right? I mean, it kind of makes it a little tougher. You know, so David's I think he's under a lot of stress right here. And, I mean, I think it's training for him. I think God's putting him through this so that David, just kind of like Moses was in for 40 years so that he could lead those obstinate Israelites, Hebrews, out of the promised land. I mean, I think it was a training ground, but I also think it was really tough for him right here. I think this was difficult. And David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him. Here's Saul going to come back down. He's going to take him again. And he says, once again, bring the ephod here, right? And David said, your servant has heard. For certain Saul is seeking to come and destroy the city. He asked for God's revelation here, for God to tell him what to do. David, point, if you look here, David and his men are 600. That's just men, right? So there's way over 1,000 people here now, probably maybe 2,000 people here. There's a lot of people here at this point. This has got to be a lot more than just a few guys running and hiding in caves. This has got to be an entourage. And I think when you get to this point, things become a lot more complicated. David and his men, they went down. They went wherever they could go. When it was told Saul that David had escaped, he gave up the pursuit. So David stayed in the wilderness, in the stronghold, remained in the hill country, and Saul sought him every day. But God did not deliver him into his hand. So we're not going to go verse by verse through the rest of this, but we're going to catch some highlights next week, kind of push through a little bit. But read this for yourself. It gets a little of the same stuff here. David's running, Saul's pursuing, David's fleeing. But there is some other things we need to look at. But you can really see it. David's rise. This is David's rise to greatness you're seeing now. So thanks for your time.